Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're sketching out the exact compliance journey for reporting greenhouse gas emissions in the containers and packaging industry, specifically under the SASB standards. If you've ever wondered how major manufacturing operations standardize something as insanely complex as their carbon footprint, well, you're in the right place. We're going to break down these highly technical requirements into a clear, actionable roadmap. Okay, let's quickly look at our roadmap for today. First, the Scope 1 packaging challenge. Second, calculating gross global emissions. Third, following the GHG protocol. Fourth, navigating emissions regulations. And finally, emission targets and strategies. Let's dive right in. Part 1, the Scope 1 packaging challenge. Understanding direct emissions. So the crucial point here is that we're looking strictly at direct physical emissions happening right on site at these packaging plants. Containers and packaging manufacturing is incredibly energy intensive. When we talk about Scope 1 emissions in this specific industry, we're talking about the direct greenhouse gases generated from burning fossil fuels to run massive manufacturing lines, process raw materials, and operate on-site cogeneration plants. Basically, it's the direct exhaust of production. Now, you might be wondering, why does this actually matter to investors? Well, managing these emissions directly improves the bottom line and significantly lowers regulatory risk. High emissions can trigger severe compliance costs or even penalties. But if you flip that around, entities that can cost-effectively manage these greenhouse gas emissions, maybe through advanced manufacturing processes or by switching to alternative fuels, they instantly improve their operating efficiency. They're essentially insulating themselves against future, more stringent global regulations. Moving on to Part 2, calculating gross global emissions, identifying the gases. The standard requires disclosure of these 7 specific gases outlined under the Kyoto Protocol, which really acts as our molecular rulebook here. You aren't just looking at carbon dioxide. To be fully compliant, an entity's data collection has to be sophisticated enough to capture methane, nitrous oxide, and various fluorocarbons like HFCs and PFCs, right alongside sulfur hexafluoride and nitrogen trifluoride. Simply put, if a factory emits it and it's on this list, it absolutely must be tracked. So with all these vastly different chemical structures, how in the world does an organization actually report them as a single number on a balance sheet? I mean, you can't just add a ton of methane to a ton of carbon dioxide, right? They interact with the atmosphere in completely different ways and trap totally different amounts of heat. To solve that puzzle, we convert everything into metric tons of CO2 equivalents, using the 100-year warming potential values, preferably from the IPCC's 5th assessment report. This creates a unified currency for emissions. By applying these specific multiplier values to the other 6 gases, a sustainability officer can collapse a highly complex atmospheric chemistry profile into one clean, standardized metric that investors can easily compare. The absolutely critical keyword to remember here is gross. You cannot, I repeat, cannot subtract your carbon credits or offsets at this stage. The standard demands raw, unadjusted emissions output. This is a super common pitfall. A company might buy millions of dollars in carbon offsets to claim their net zero, but SASB metric 110A1 requires absolute transparency regarding what is physically leaving the smokestack. The gross figure tells the true story of operational efficiency before any financial engineering or environmental compensation takes place. All right, Part 3, following the GHG protocol, the calculation rulebook. As you can see, the quantitative requirement for RT-CP 110.1 leaves no room for guesswork. The standard doesn't just ask for a number, it dictates the exact accounting principles you need to use to arrive at it. So the actual workflow a sustainability officer has to follow goes exactly like this. First, start with the 2004 GHG protocol as your base rulebook. Next, apply any local EPA or ISO guidance. And finally, consolidate everything using the financial control approach. That last step is vital. It means your environmental data boundaries must match your financial data boundaries. If you have financial control over a subsidiary packaging plant, you own their Scope 1 emissions in your reporting, plain and simple. That brings us to Part 4, navigating emissions regulations. What is actually covered? Next up, companies have to calculate and report the exact percentage of their total Scope 1 emissions that are subject to direct regulatory limits. This just requires dividing the emissions capped by local or international law by the total global emissions. This gives stakeholders a crystal clear view of the company's immediate regulatory exposure. Crucially, only strict, mandatory systems like cap and trade or carbon taxes actually count here. Voluntary trading schemes, they do not make the cut.
If a facility operates under the EU ETS or the California Cap and Trade Program, those emissions are included in the numerator. But if a factory is only subject to a rule that says they must report their emissions without actually limiting them, they're completely excluded from this specific percentage calculation.
And finally, Part 5, Emission Targets and Strategies, looking to the future. When you're laying out your emission reduction plans, the standard requires you to be completely transparent. Are you using a hard, absolute reduction target or an intensity-based target tied to a metric like revenue or production volume? Let me explain the difference. An absolute target means a company promises to emit, say, 10,000 fewer tons of CO2 next year, full stop. An intensity-based target means they promise to emit less CO2 times per cardboard box manufactured. Both are valid, but the standard requires total transparency about which one you're using, including revealing the exact denominator if it's intensity-based. When fleshing out this strategic plan, you have to make sure investors understand not just the what, but the exact how, when, and how much is this going to cost. You have to clearly define your base year. That's the starting line against which all progress is measured. You must disclose the actual mechanisms for reduction, whether that's installing new energy-efficient processing units or shifting over to renewable fuels. And vitally, you must discuss the risks and limiting factors that could potentially derail these plans.
Oh, and there's a huge, critical caveat here. You cannot report on hypothetical future brainstorming. Disclosure is strictly limited to emission reduction activities that were actually active or completed during the reporting period. SASB wants to see real execution, not just good intentions. If a project was merely a proposal on a whiteboard during the fiscal year, it simply doesn't belong in this disclosure.
Mastering these accounting mechanics doesn't just ensure compliance, it literally drives profound operational efficiency. You aren't just filling out a spreadsheet here, you're charting a course for a much more resilient future. So the real question is, now that you can accurately measure your packaging footprint, how aggressively are you willing to shrink it?